Okay, great. I'm going to share my screen now. Let's see. Okay. Is that visible?
Yes.
Okay, nice and big. Everybody can see that clearly?
Yes.
Okay, great. Well, good evening, everybody. It's nice to be with you virtually. It's a real pleasure to be able to be the first speaker of your fall program. I was asked today to share a little bit with you about one of our preserves in Western Virginia that is a pretty interesting place and has had a pretty interesting history the last 15 years or so. And so without further ado, I'll just launch right in and I'll have time at the end for questions. So today we'll be discussing Chestnut Ridge Natural Area Preserve, as you can see. But first, I wanted to start out by introducing myself and the program I work for a little bit. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the Virginia Natural Heritage Program, but perhaps not everybody. So I thought I'd start by introducing myself and my colleagues a little bit. So the Virginia Natural Heritage Program is a team of just incredibly bright, motivated, passionate individuals that you can see here at a preserve in Floyd County a couple years ago who worked together for the purpose of conserving the biodiversity, Virginia's biodiversity through inventory, protection, and stewardship. And I'm going to talk a little bit about each of those three pieces of our mission this evening. The currency with which we document, measure, monitor, and restore biodiversity is something we call natural heritage resources. And so these are defined in the Code of Virginia as essentially the habitat or the niche of rare, threatened, or endangered plant and animal species, as well as the natural communities that provide habitat for those species, as well as significant geologic sites such as karst features, and similar features of scientific interest benefiting the welfare of Virginians. So you might wonder, just how many natural heritage resources do we track in Virginia? There are over 9,000 populations of rare plants comprising a little over 600 species that are considered natural heritage resources, or almost 1 out of 3 plant species in Virginia. Similarly, there are nearly 200 vertebrates, or about a third of all vertebrate species in Virginia are considered natural heritage resources, as well as 233 natural communities which support these species. Virginia is in a very strategic part of the country when we think about conserving biodiversity. This figure here shows colors ranging from cooler colors to warmer colors that indicate the richness of rare species or imperiled species. And you can see that geographically, Virginia, with its Blue Ridge Mountains and the Central Appalachian and Allegheny Mountains in particular, is in a nationally significant hotspot of biodiversity. So the work we do where we do it really matters for conserving biodiversity. And so when we think about biodiversity and its conservation, not only do we live in an important place for working on that mission, but we also live in an important time. We are all familiar with, I'm sure, the stories of the loss of species over the last couple of centuries. But another interesting way to think about the Earth's biodiversity, because diversity, right, isn't just the number of species, but it's their relative abundances. So not only has there been a loss in the number of species, but these data here that were put together in the Living Planet report by the World Wildlife Fund a couple of years ago show the reduction in biomass of the rest of the species. So not only are there fewer species, but the Living Planet Index shown here shows the decline in the biomass of the species that remain. So there are fewer species and fewer individuals of those species right now. So we live in an important place at an important time for conserving biodiversity. And if we take a closer look at what's going on in North America in terms of the drivers of these reductions in the biomass of native species, we see that here in North America, while there are multiple causes ranging from pollution and invasive species, the overall driver of this loss in the abundance of native species is the loss of habitat. And so back, if you picture that large, happy group of folks that comprise the Virginia Natural Heritage Program that I showed you on a previous slide, you picture those people drive this process. So essentially our mission in the Natural Heritage Program begins with what I like to think of as a biological treasure hunt. Using a variety of sources, our inventory staff go all over the Commonwealth, above ground, below ground. They dig in historic records. They scour the landscape looking for rare species and natural communities. And so they collect this treasure trove of ecological data, which is then managed in a living GIS database, which then uses these data to share with stakeholders to minimize the impacts to biodiversity of certain large projects. These data are also used to design a protection strategy. So in order to conserve biodiversity, we need to first know what critical habitats exist and where they are and how they're doing. And then these data also inform the design of natural area preserves and help the folks in the stewardship section, of which I am a part, come up with management plans and restoration strategies to conserve and enhance that biodiversity. So another way to think about what that team of folks does is that our job is to protect the last of the least and the best of the rest when it comes to native species in Virginia. And I mentioned in the previous slide, natural area preserves. These are natural area preserves exist across the Commonwealth, and they exist for the purpose of protecting the habitat that's most critical to conserving biodiversity. And as of this actually figures slightly out of date, there's a little over 59,000 acres now that have been protected in our natural area preserve system. So you can think of these 59,000 acres as capturing much of the crown jewels of Virginia's biodiversity. And today we're just going to spend time virtually exploring one of these preserves here, Chestnut Ridge Natural Area Preserve, located right kind of at the intersection of the state line with West Virginia and Giles and Bland County. So not too far from Blacksburg and very much a part of the New River Valley. Here's a little bit closer look of where Chestnut Ridge Natural Area Preserve, shown in red, exists just south of Buckhorn Mountain. Let's see, I'm going to try to turn on, do I have a pointer? I don't know, can you see my mouse?
Yes.
Okay,
Yes.
So for reference, here's the New River. This is Highway 61, which follows Wolf Creek. And this right here is the town of Narrows, Virginia. And then this is 77 over here. So this distance is about 16 miles from Rocky Gap to Narrows. Just point out, since this is the New River chapter of the Native Plant Society, that this little cyan colored polygon here is the Narrows Preserve, owned by the Nature Conservancy, which is where Peters Mountain mallow is protected. Some of you may have heard its story. And if not, Google that. Google Peters Mountain mallow. There's a great conservation story there. But other great conservation stories are unfolding right here at Chestnut Ridge Natural Area Preserve as well. So this is just to show you a little bit of the landscape context. Let's see. Next slide. Okay. So Chestnut Ridge Natural Area Preserve, I mentioned on my first slide that a great story of conservation has been unfolding there over the last decade and a half. And that story begins in 2006, actually almost late September in 2006, when the family that owned this property sold a conservation easement to both the 500-Year Forest Foundation and DCR, the Natural Heritage Program. And that easement protected 233 acres, predominantly old growth forest within a very large tract of unbroken forest, much of it owned by this same family that had managed the land for its timber production. But this particular steep section on the south slope of Chestnut Ridge had included about 140 acres of old growth that had never been logged. And so this conservation easement was created just over 15 years ago. Worth pointing out, I know this is the Native Plant Society meeting, but there's more than just plants are protected in this watershed and in this vicinity of this preserve. I mentioned Wolf Creek is the predominant stream feature in this valley. You can see it on this map at the bottom there. And Chestnut Ridge Natural Area Preserve drains mostly to Wolf Creek. That watershed contains 2 records, one extant and one historic, of 2 really interesting local fauna, the candy darter shown there above, and then the hellbender salamander shown below, which unfortunately has not been documented in the better part of 70 years, but it is still possible that it could either be restored to that habitat or may still exist. Within Chestnut Ridge Natural Area Preserve, their botanical surveys have found over 200 native plant species, including 37 trees and a little over a dozen native shrubs and vines. And as I mentioned, much of the preserve contains old growth chestnut oak and northern red oak forests, and those are shown in dark green. The 3 rare plants that exist within this preserve include the mountain pimpernel, shown here, a increasingly rare tree, white butternut or white walnut. 3 of them exist within the preserve, and a couple small populations of American ginseng. So these are our 3 rarest plants within the preserve. Nearly 200 native animals also live within the preserve, and 2 of them are also considered rare. They include the green salamander, shown here, which lives in rocky cracks at the top of Chestnut Ridge, where there's a lot of exposed bedrock and regolith, and the Blackburnian warbler, a migratory songbird that uses this large unbroken forest habitat during the breeding season. These species exist within one of 8 natural community types that are found within the preserve, and those are shown here. And I'll talk about each of those briefly in a little bit, but just at this point, what I'd like you to take away from this slide is that there are 8 different types of forests exist within this preserve, and sections of each of these community types contains patches of old growth. But since I've used that term old growth forest, I want to take a minute to talk about what that means and what that looks like. So defining characteristics of old growth forest vary, first and foremost. Truth be told, I've heard definitions from folks in the forestry department at Virginia Tech that range from areas of forest that have never been logged to, more colloquially, it's the parts of the forest where the fairies are. And so I enjoy all of those definitions, but kind of a middle of the road definition provided by the Forest Service is a forest that has a minimum stand age of at least 130 years. So basically, the cohort of canopy trees is at least 130 years old. Specific species can have various ranges in age, depending on the species, that can also be used to define old growth. And tree size, it also is considered a measurement of old growth, although this can be tricky and lead to what are called cryptic old growth forests, where because of low fertility or certain site conditions, shallow soils, tree growth can be very stunted, yet trees can still be old. So I tend to use forest tree age as a good measurement. But in addition to that, excellent indicators of old growth forest condition are the presence of large tip-up mounds where large trees have fallen over and rotted away, the abundance of large woody debris and snags and logs on the ground. A significant portion of the carbon locked up in old growth forest is in the form of this downed woody material. So the presence of these sorts of features, both of these photos were taken within the preserve, indicate old growth condition as well. Also want to talk about natural disturbance regimes that can be found within old growth forests. So we often think of old growth as this sort of steady state, this stable primeval condition. And while there are large tracts within an old growth forest, there is something to be said for that. It's important to recognize that natural disturbances are an important part of maintaining the health of these systems. And here in Virginia, there are several natural disturbances, some of which are still going on in the landscape and some of which are not. And I'm going to talk about just 3 of those real quick and why they're important. So historically, within the Central Appalachians, there were relatively frequent low-intensity surface fires that had ignition sources from both natural sources like lightning, as well as anthropogenic sources from the native people, indigenous folks that lived here. And these fires occurred on 5 to 40-year return intervals on average, depending on the forest type and its specific location within the landscape. In addition, other disturbances that can create similar gaps within the forest canopy are damage from ice storms or wind events creating blowdowns. And so on average, in a couple studies done on old growth within the Smokies, they found that about 1% of the area of the remaining old growth 1% on average experienced some sort of canopy gap creating event per year. So just a relatively small part of the disturbance on the landscape, but an important part. Another source of disturbance that created canopy gaps in old growth forests that doesn't exist, unfortunately, anymore. It's been just about 114 years, I think, since the died. But historically, the passenger pigeon, that we're familiar with its story of abundance and rapid decline, that it could actually be lethal to the tree species within trees within which they roosted. So those, oh, I got a little notice that my connection's unstable. Can you still hear me?
Yeah, there was frozen for about a half a minute, so
okay,
missed something or other.
All right, I'm sorry. Half a minute. Let's see.
You probably just started talking about the roost and that.
Okay, so thank you. Sorry about that, folks. You know, I'll turn maybe I'll just do this. I'll stop video, that'll free up some bandwidth. I'll turn it back on later. So yeah, passenger pigeons were another source of natural disturbance on the landscape. When they would roost in trees in large enough numbers, the deposition of inorganic nitrogen could sometimes kill patches of these trees in the forest and create openings. Similarly, when spread out over larger areas, such as at nesting sites, these inorganic amendments of nitrogen would increase tree growth. So kind of a unique thing to think about on within the context of old growth forests on the landscape. And so these openings were very important because they increased diversity in the forest by creating patches of essentially grassland species within the forest matrix, so increasing landscape scale diversity. But additionally, these gaps we've come to appreciate more recently how important they are for certain rare or declining species, such as migratory songbirds. So while many species of migratory songbirds, including the species like the wood thrush found here, which inhabit Chestnut Ridge Natural Area Preserve, they nest within mature old growth forests and do quite well. However, only very recently did we begin to appreciate that at different parts of their life cycle, namely during the fledgling stage, so after a bird has left the nest, but before it has completed or undertaken its first migration south, for a few week period, the best place in that forest matrix to be for that bird is in an opening or on an edge. And so these small openings within a large unbroken forest are for a very short period of absolute perfect habitat for species such as wood thrush. And so these canopy gaps have an important role. So really what I was hoping to help folks imagine here is an old growth forest with large trees that are very old, lots of organic matter on the ground, but a certain element of patchiness where there's the odd opening here and there with grassland species and shrub species and blackberries and things like that, that broke up that otherwise unbroken landscape. And those patches we've come to appreciate have great value for diversity at higher trophic levels. Okay, so I mentioned that there are 8 forest types that contain old growth features within Chestnut Ridge Natural Area Preserve. Just going to take a quick tour of those now with some variety of photographs to help you virtually see what this place looks like. So the largest, the greatest area of old growth forest within the preserve is within a dry music chestnut oak, northern red oak forest. About 80 acres of the original 233 acres of the preserve fall into that category. This forest contains obviously chestnut oak and northern red oak, but a variety of other native hardwoods and shrubs as well that are listed here. The oldest species that our oldest individual tree that we've found within this stand is over 300 years old and over 1 meter in diameter at breast height. And here are some photos that one of my colleagues, Irv Wilson, took of that particular forest. And there's a nice one of a chestnut oak there. The second largest forest within the preserve that contains old growth features is this oak heath forest, so named for the dominance of oak species in the canopy and the abundance of acidic loving heath shrub species in the understory. This particular forest type, the largest, oldest tree of significance that we found is a black gum that was over 250 years old. At a few sheltered sites lower on the preserve, closer to Wolf Creek, there are a couple patches of rich cove and slope forest where we pick up some different species such as red hickory, cucumber magnolia, tulip poplar that require higher soil moisture conditions to thrive. And this is probably one of the richer sites on the preserve in terms of herbaceous species diversity. Particularly large amount of wood nettle and black cohosh. And this is also where we have those 3 butternut trees that I mentioned, mature butternut trees. Another forest type within the preserve is a montane oak hickory forest, where we have the highest concentration of hickory biomass within the preserve in the form of a couple different species of Carya, as well as a decent amount in the mid-story of hop hornbeam, which is a really pretty cool species that I think is under-celebrated. Of all of the species that I can think of within the forests of the Central Appalachian, this species is particularly resistant to ice damage. I mentioned the importance of ice damage for canopy gaps, but this species in particular, it's very strong wood, but also it just has, I think the form of it is such that the branches are get so fine and so small, they just don't seem to do a very good job accumulating the weight of ice when it's being deposited. So there seem just a non-peer-reviewed observation to share that hop hornbeam is pretty interesting in that it seems resistant to ice damage. And then there are some sections that are, this picture sort of captures it, but that are extremely steep boulder fields that have some very large chestnut oak and some old growth tulip poplar based on some tree cores that were done. These cores were taken about 10 years ago. So I guess it's even older now. But so this boulder field forest, it's very difficult to traverse, but it's an extremely steep, but it too contains old growth, sections of old growth forest, most likely just because of just how the sheer difficulty of access to this part of the preserve. There's another picture looking kind of up the boulder field, up and out of the boulder field. And then actually this picture is pretty fun because you can see if you look closely here, this is like a blooper in a movie, right? If you look closely, you can see the landowner there, but his back is to us. That's Bob. And he was, this was a picture I took a few years ago, exploring part of the property with Bob. But in this section of forest, there's several chestnut oaks, the oldest of which is nearly 2.5 centuries old. But other oak species found within the chestnut oak forest here at Chestnut Ridge include scarlet oak and black oak as well. Another really rich and dense layer of heath species here as well, including mountain laurels, blueberries, deerberries, huckleberries, and then a notable abundance of pink lady slipper orchid, particularly in early May, is within this part of the preserve. So that's kind of a quick tour of the 8 forest types found within Chestnut Ridge Natural Area Preserve. I want to move on next and talk a little bit about some of the threats to these forests and these rare species. And really there's 2 primary threats to the biodiversity we're seeking to conserve and restore within the preserve. And one of those is invasive plant species, which we're all familiar with that threat, but it's noteworthy here because for 2 reasons. One is the invasive plant species found within Chestnut Ridge Natural Area Preserve are in a fairly spatially restricted area along some of the old logging roads that crossed this site. And so we're very fortunate in the sense that the few species we have are concentrated into a relatively small area. However, all of these species are species that can be particularly damaging to recruitment of native shrubs and trees. So they're particularly potentially bad ones to have within these ecosystems, but their spatial extent is small enough that I think there's a good chance that we can do something about these. And then, yeah, there's this other minor existential threat going on called climate change. And so this is a graph we've all seen showing rising CO2 over the last half century and change. But what is the direct effect of this on places like Chestnut Ridge? Well, considering that question, in my opinion, the most immediate direct adverse effect or threat to the ecological integrity of this preserve is rapidly changing average temperatures. So we're all familiar with the maps showing species ranges, from north to south based on timing of spring, coldest temperature of the year, warmest temperature of the year. So species have a bandwidth within which they're happy and able to successfully reproduce. And interesting paper came out not long ago that basically said that in the next 60 years, the effective climate on the ground in cities in North America will move 500 miles north, or 8
Wow.
miles a year. So essentially the climate of places like Blacksburg and Roanoke, just pick a town 8 miles south every year, and that's kind of what you have to look forward to. So that line keeps moving south and will ultimately move south such that 60 years from now, the climate here will be very similar to the climate of Northeast Texas or Northwest Louisiana, Southwest Arkansas, somewhere in there. And so those temperature changes pose a real threat to the ability of these species to reproduce where they are. Now, the rapidness of this change in temperature might not correspond direct to as rapid a change in the forest at Chestnut Ridge Natural Area Preserve, because the species that are there, they may enter a phase at which they can survive, but they can no longer successfully competitively reproduce. So the forests do have a lag time in some sense because of that mechanism. But either way, this is a very real threat to the integrity and the stability of places like Chestnut Ridge and the old growth forests that they contain. So what are we doing about these 2 threats? So with respect to managing invasive plants, we're primarily relying at this point on chemical options to control invasive species, always looking for other options for a more integrated approach. But I wanted to share some success we've had with management of Japanese stiltgrass. So these are 2 chemicals that I have used to manage this species with good success. And one I want to mention that may be some new information to folks who might be managing these species as well, is that we've played around with really dialing down the concentration of glyphosate to essentially below labeled rates. And so we've diluted glyphosate to as low as 1/4 or 0.5%, just taking advantage of the fact that Japanese stiltgrass has such a weak cuticle that makes it very vulnerable we think, to chemical action. So here's two photos of treating Japanese stiltgrass with glyphosate. And you'll recall glyphosate is a broad spectrum herbicide that is labeled to pretty much kill everything that photosynthesizes. But when dialed down to this 1/4 or 0.5%, you can see in these photographs, the photograph in the left, that's just a cinquefoil, and the photograph on the right shows a red bud. But both of these areas were essentially, totally sprayed, complete foliar coverage with a backpack, and that low rate was enough that some of the natives were not susceptible, but all of the stiltgrass was. So that's some interesting success that we've had there. And then another invasive tree that exists within the preserve, this preserve and many other preserves that we've had a lot of success with managing using the cut stump, or more often hack and squirt, which is simply when you cut into the cambium and then inject a constant high concentration of herbicide like glyphosate. And this is a treatment that can be effective pretty much any month of the year, except when the sap is running from roots to shoots in the spring, because essentially then the physiology of the tree is working against you. As for comments on climate change, just a couple comments about the importance of conserving and managing these forests for their old growth condition. There's a relatively new term out there called proforestation that some researchers up in New England wrote a paper on just 2 or 3 years ago. And the idea there is proforestation is a type of management where the management goal is to sequester as much carbon in the forest as possible. And there's a couple things that can be done to promote that, but in our case, really the thing that makes the most sense is to more or less leave the forest be, with a couple of exceptions, including managing invasive plants that could harm recruitment and potentially adding some forest species that were there historically, but have recently been extirpated. And so when you think about Chestnut Ridge, it's not just vulnerable to climate change, but in its own small way, it can be part of a bigger solution. And that is that on average, forests of the Central Appalachians that are dominated by oak trees can store about 80 tons of carbon, not carbon dioxide, but 80 tons of carbon per acre. And that's a hard number to interpret. And so just throw one thing out there to help us get our heads around that. Average American energy use creates 4.5 tons of carbon each year. So you do a little bit of math, and over an 80-year lifespan, what that means is if each person could preserve and protect 4 acres of old growth forest, that aspect of our ecological footprint would sort of even out. But anyway, so 80 tons per acre can be sequestered within old growth forests such as Chestnut Ridge Natural Area Preserve. So that's pretty cool.
Year or?
No, that is the total sink. So that is that is an old growth in a steady state. Good question, by the way. I'm not sure who asked that, but that is a great question. No, that's not a per year rate. That is once it reaches a balance between photosynthesis and decomposition, that is the net sink, because trees can't, for example, grow they get to a certain size that's a max, and then they die and begin to slowly decompose. So it does get more nuanced than this, but in terms of the carbon sequestered in dead biomass, soil in the O horizon, and living biomass, this is about what peak biomass would be, 80 tons per acre. The per year rate depends on time since disturbance. So the per year rate after, say, an ice storm is going to be really high early on and then slow down. Whereas in that same ice damaged gap, the initial rate of decomposition would be really low, but as the system matures and there's more large or tree trunks and branches and things on the ground, that decomposition rate increases. And eventually they cross at this sort of steady state of 80 tons of carbon per acre. And there's an approximate in there for a good reason, because this is highly variable. That's just an average that takes into account different types of oak-dominated forests and different soils at different aspects and things like that. Good question. But to that question, there's something else I wanted to mention, and that is by protecting and managing forests for forests that have very high age class stands, so very old trees, there's an added benefit here, which is there's a growing appreciation that old trees continue to sequester a large amount of carbon for as long as they're alive. And the easiest way I know to visualize this is if you picture a tree such as this northern red oak shown here next to my colleague Wes. Picture a year of new growth, a new growth ring on this tree. Even if it's a small ring, because of the size of that tree, just the basic geometry is such that that's a large amount of wood produced in that single growth ring. And so large trees continue to sequester carbon. In fact, nearly 99% of all trees in North America sequester more carbon as they get older. And so when I first read this paper that came out a couple of years ago, I just thought I'd share with you the honest truth. The first thing that popped into my head when I read this paper was a children's book that I had read a long time ago, The Chronicles of Narnia. I'm sure many of you read it. And the first thing that popped into my book was that one of the last pages in the book is about King Peter and Queen Susan, and they were described as wonderful leaders. And the example that C.S. Lewis chose to write about to describe what constitutes a benevolent monarch is that they saved good trees from being cut down. So I like to think that the kings and queens of Narnia were concerned with carbon sequestration as much as we are now today, maybe. So other projects that we hope to undertake in the not too distant future at Chestnut Ridge Natural Area Preserve include restoring the populations of American chestnut as these blight resistant lines become available. And so there's a couple different projects out there looking at both transgenic production of using transgenic technologies to produce blight resistant American chestnut, as well as backcross with resistant species, with a resistant species of Chinese chestnut. And our hope is that this preserve, which has abundant American chestnut logs from dead canopy trees and resprouts from rootstock, can be a place where we can begin restoring the species in situ instead of in more experimental settings, such as are shown here on some reclaimed coal mines. Another nice, in addition to the many benefits I'm sure folks are familiar with of American chestnut, such as that they regularly masted, they were fast growing trees that produced a rot resistant hardwood. An added benefit from our perspective to American chestnut trees is that they also have, from a carbon sequestration perspective, some superior properties to other species such as red oak or walnut, in that they sequester more carbon of a more stable form resistant to decay than other common species in the Central Alps, such as red oak. So not only would this be wonderful to restore from a biodiversity perspective, but there's a carbon sequestration advantage to American chestnut restoration as well. So this is very much on our radar and something we're watching closely with the hope that this can become part of the management at Chestnut Ridge Natural Area Preserve. In addition, American chestnut, unfortunately, is not the only native tree of the Central Appalachians to suffer from an invasive, non-native invasive pathogen. Around 1960, early 1960s, mid 1960s, a fungal pathogen was also introduced that had a not quite as devastating, but a similarly devastating effect on the butternut or white walnut populations in the eastern United States. It essentially wiped out between 80 and 90% of these trees. So there are resistant phenotypes on the landscape, and the Forest Service and other folks are working on finding those phenotypes and propagating those phenotypes as part of the early phases of a restoration effort. So the fact that we have 3 trees that at last check were alive and well Our intention is to continue to monitor those trees and try to encourage the recruitment as best they can. These nuts need to find light gaps, so canopy gaps in the forest to grow. So there's a potential that we could create some close to the mother trees there in the forest. But so three-step process here: monitor thin interspecific competitors near the parent trees, and then potentially incorporate these three individuals into efforts to produce resistant genotypes of butternut if these three individuals continue to do well. So, and then lastly, while it's not in the cards, so to speak, at this time, although that may be changing soon, prescribed fire management would have significant ecological benefits to this preserve. And so this photo is not a photo of Chestnut Ridge Natural Area Preserve, but it's a relatively nearby and similar forest on Mount Rogers Natural Recreation Area where there is prescribed fire management. So you can see some of the fire effects, some of the direct fire effects in the more open understory. You see a lot of stems without leaves, and you can also see some of the direct effects of fire in terms of how the regrowth, the rapid growth of vegetation on the forest soil there. So prescribed fire has myriad ecological benefits, promoting oak regeneration being one of them, promoting the diversity of fire adapted species in the forest floor, creating small canopy gaps that benefit sun-loving plants and migratory songbirds. And then from a carbon sequestration perspective, when we think of fire, unfortunately, a lot of the images we see are catastrophically severe wildfires in the Western United States, but under moderate prescribed fire conditions, very low severity, low intensity burns, there's actually a carbon benefit, which is ash itself stimulates primary production. It has lots of nitrogen and phosphorus in the mineral form that plants can rapidly uptake. In addition, charcoal produced by prescribed fire is very chemically stable and resistant to decay. So the charcoal produced in a fire is a form of carbon that remains locked up for a very long time in a forest. So when it comes to thinking about fire effects on forests, it very much depends upon the intensity of that fire and the severity of that fire in terms of the pace of ecological change brought about by that burn. And so in these forests, such as at Chestnut Ridge, low severity, low intensity burn would predominantly bring about ecological benefits for the preserve. So until recently, the fact that Chestnut Ridge was essentially a mid-slope preserve of a few hundred acres with no good natural breaks. There was no river at the bottom of the preserve. The preserve didn't even go quite all the way up to the ridge. So it was just a topographic impossibility to consider prescribed fire management within this preserve. But happily, the story of Chestnut Ridge in just the last couple of years has had some very positive developments. So 2020 was 2020. That being said, 2020 ended in a wonderful note for conservation in the New River Valley, which is this 233 acre preserve, effective actually December 31st, 2020, expanded to 808 acres. So the original preserve shown in green grew to the 808 acre preserve shown in gold on this map, to protect not only the core old growth forest, but also very high quality forest surrounding it. And in addition, this green preserve went from private ownership to fee simple ownership, so a state-owned natural area preserve. So 233 acres grew on December 31st, 2020, into a size that captures natural features on the landscape in a way that begins to make prescribed fire something we can think about a little more seriously. And at this point in time, this is public information, but a second phase of expansion of the preserve is underway to increase the preserve to just over 1,400 acres with the purchase of an adjacent property shown in blue. All of these tracts were owned by the same family, the original owners of Chestnut Ridge Natural Area Preserve. And so this creates a lot of new exciting possibilities, not just perhaps the potential for prescribed fire management. If you do the math, these forests, once they've all reached an old growth condition, will sequester almost about 415,000 tons of CO2. These habitats have only just, or these lands have only just begun to be explored. And so there are potentially more old growth forests to find. There's certainly more to make, as well as new forests and wetlands to inventory for rare species. And then lastly, this preserve is truly a core forest, and in the sense that it has a very high core to perimeter ratio. And that's especially significant these days. A few years ago, a paper came out by Nick Haddad that analyzed global forest cover and found that nearly 3/4 of all of the forests on the planet are less than about 1,000 yards from a road. And so this protection of Chestnut Ridge and the expansion of the preserve puts it into the category, that 30% category, that it's over 1 kilometer to a road from parts of this preserve. So that's pretty cool. And this being a core forest, the funding that made this protection achievement possible came from the Core Forest Fund, which was a fund established by Mountain Valley Pipeline Company as mitigation to forest fragmentation. So that's some very positive developments in the conservation story of Chestnut Ridge, a little bit of a virtual tour of the preserve, and a little bit about what we've done and hope to do there. So last slide I have before I'm happy to take any questions for the next, I guess I have 10 minutes here. It's just to summarize that old growth forests these days have become very rare, and yet their rareness is inversely proportional to their ecological value. We can conserve, protect, and restore these forests through land protection and management, such as proforestation for carbon sequestration. Where at Chestnut Ridge in particular, our boots on the ground work is focused on invasive species management. And we hope to expand that to include reintroduction of extirpated species and perhaps the reintroduction of prescribed fire for landscape ecological benefits. And so the last thing I want to say is, thinking back, I love this phrase. We've heard about curves a lot in recent years, but before all that started, there was a paper that I mentioned already, the Living Planet report, that talks about bending the curve. So when you think of this particular curve, the curve here in black being a biodiversity index, showing the abundance of not just of rare species, but also the abundance of common species as declining over the past century, and different actions that can be taken to bend that curve. And those include, if you look at this closely, the different scenarios here that range from simple land protection, so conservation efforts in green, to active stewardship, and then thinking about sustainability models of economic supply and demand stuff. But point being is that in the bigger picture, protecting places like Chestnut Ridge and then taking care of them in such a way that maximizes their biodiversity potential and their carbon sequestration potential is all part of turning what has been a downward trajectory in conservation biology for some time now into a positive trend where we start to make gains in these various theaters of biodiversity conservation. So real pleasure to share with you about this place this evening. I hope you're all doing well wherever you are. And now I'm happy to take any questions you may have. And I'm going to turn my camera back on now. Okay.
There is one question in the chat from Bruce Grimes. Are there any data collection efforts for invertebrate diversity and population trends?
I'm not muted. Hey, thank you for that question. That's a great question. And no, there are not at this preserve currently. Other preserves and places, absolutely, but no, there aren't. And so there's tremendous data collection need at this preserve, and there's some capacity for natural heritage staff to do that. But I like to think that the proximity of this preserve to places like Virginia Tech and Radford and other schools uh, creates a certain opportunity for partnerships to do more monitoring and ask questions like that.
I have a question. How wide, this is Mary, how widespread was that butternut? Was it very popular or just widespread or both?
So at the preserve, there are 3 trees. That's it.
No, I mean historically around here.
Oh,
in its natural range. I hadn't heard of it before.
I see. I honestly don't know the answer to that question. I don't think it would. I do know it was never anywhere near as abundant on the landscape as species like American chestnut. That said, I've seen maybe a dozen of individual trees in Virginia. I saw a couple up near Wintergreen in the Blue Ridge, and then I've seen these 3, and that's all I can recall right now. But no, I think it's always been one of the less common species on the landscape, but nevertheless, it has declined from whatever its historic abundance was by about 80% in the last half century.
And is it self-fertile?
I don't know, Mary.
Well, you said you're getting nuts on those trees, right?
So yeah, presumably, but I honestly don't know.
Maybe I'll look it up. I haven't
Physiology.
heard of that species. Yeah, it's interesting.
Let me know what you find, Mary.
My homework.
How do you manage the cold foot?
Well, honestly, we haven't treated that one yet there, but where I've treated it elsewhere, we use a broadleaf herbicide. So not glyphosate, just something that will only adversely affect dicots.
So you use exclusively then, you don't do mechanical removal, you do exclusively with herbicides?
No, we judge each problem as it comes. So no, there's different approaches that we do depending on the scale of the problem, the species we're trying to manage, access, extent of the infestation. So we use mechanical, absolutely. Even for Japanese stiltgrass, sometimes we'll use mechanical if it's small enough. But once it gets to a particular scale of over a large distance or a large area, usually herbicide's the best tool.
So if you have a stand of Japanese stiltgrass, what you're trying to do is with the herbicide is to keep it from seeding.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, we wouldn't treat it. We usually just treat it in June and July, a little bit into August. Just once you get to September, it's usually getting close to being too late.
So is when you're hitting it in June and July, you're actually trying to kill it?
Yes.
And so would a weed whacker work if you weed whacked it?
It could, and we do use a weed whacker on some places, like certain trail sides at a couple of our preserves, like Buffalo Mountain. We've used a weed whacker to manage stiltgrass along the trails there, for example. So weed whacker can work. It's tricky though, because if you have a real commercial weed eater and you're trying to mow this relatively low grass, if you end up weed eating the soil surface and making a lot of disturbance, you're kind of just creating the perfect environment for stiltgrass to grow again. So to answer your question, we do use weed whackers sometimes, but only when it's a really limited area.
But even if you disturb the soil, it has a seed bank, right? So anything's going to end up disturbing the soil. John Ford used to remove invasives with us, and he said, I told him that seems like it's a problem if you start I've been told that disturbing the soil is not good. And he says, no, then you get the seeds out of there. So,
Well, that's true. And I usually, if there's this, we don't usually start to see visible progress in terms of the cover of stiltgrass until we've treated at least 5 years in a row. Whatever the treatment, just because it seems to take about that long for the seed bank to start to, I won't say exhaust, but decline.
so how do you deal with, okay, something, we remove invasives in stadium woods. So something I'm starting to notice now, in some areas we clear, and now we're getting little tiny seedlings I recognize, so I can yank them out. And we have a small acreage. We don't have to do what you do. So what do you do about all those little seedlings and stuff? Do you just wait till they get big enough to deal with as a plant, or how do you deal with this? I mean, you wouldn't obviously have time to do all that.
No, I guess I'm just having trouble visualizing the exact scenario, but you know, it's one of those things where I think when deciding my management approach for stiltgrass, the first question I always ask is, whatever I do, can I keep doing this for at least 5 years?
Yes.
Because otherwise it's kind of a waste, it's just not efficient. So, and in an ideal set, and this is, here's something that here's a scenario that has played out. So there's a Grassy Hill Natural Area Preserve in Franklin County. There's a West Loop Trail system. It's a couple miles long. And our first management that I was involved in of stiltgrass on that loop was 10 years ago. And we started walking the loop twice a year with herbicide and backpacks, so not a lot, just a few gallons on the whole several miles. And there are parts of that about 5 years ago, parts of that trail that it really did turn into take a hike with a garbage bag and just get the odd plant that's left. And now there are sections of that trail we don't treat anymore because there's no stiltgrass. So, in an ideal scenario, you go from a more to a less aggressive approach with time.
So one thing I was thinking about, the seedlings like a little English ivy and little bittersweet, and when those things first come in, I mean, on the large scale you're doing, you can't pay attention to those little seedlings, so you have to wait till they get to where you can see them, right?
Well, I think the answer to your question is yes, but I will say, if this talk had been on a different topic, I could have. I mean, I have photos of myself and my colleagues with herbicide and cups half this size and a paintbrush and pruning shears. Sometimes we use very fine scalpels. I mean, we could be working on a preserve that's 1,000 acres, but if there's a technique that you can intensively apply to, say, a shrubby species like Japanese spirea, where you can have really good fast control with a cut stem approach, and there's minimal seed bank concerns, I would rather intensively treat a half acre and be more or less done with it than to unintensively treat by, say, foliar spray 10 acres. Because it's just, I think of it as like finding an anchor point and getting, whatever the scale is, if you can get a high level of long-term eradication and get that area done and then build out from that each year, to me, that's more efficient than getting half of it over a larger area.
So do you have would each site have a unique plan for management because of what's happening there?
Yes.
And then when you said you added plants to increase the, like understory plants, I think that's what you were talking about. How do you determine that?
So in the case of Chestnut Ridge, no plants have been added at this time, but the hope is that we can reintroduce American chestnut there. So that's what I was talking about there. Other ways to increase plant diversity would be something like prescribed fire, which that disturbance, and this is again, let me think, here's an example. There's a preserve up in Augusta County called Mount Joy Pond. And we conducted over the last 6 years 2 prescribed burns there. And after one of those prescribed burns in an area that hadn't been burned in probably 60 years, federally listed plant Small World Begonia came up because it was the right, that disturbance created the right higher light conditions for that plant to come out of dormancy in the bud bank. So that's another way to make plants reappear, recreate the natural disturbance that benefits those species that are no longer visible. Anyway, lots of good questions.
Thank you.
Hey, Ryan, this is Will. How
Hey,
you
Will.
doing? Hey, man. Hey, so with the expanded preserve that you got coming there at Chestnut Ridge, you're getting a lot of new slopes and a lot of new bedrock types and a lot of new slope aspects. What other communities are on those new tracks that, and EOs might be on those new tracks that aren't on the core of the preserve?
That's a good question. And the one that jumps out to mind first, Will, is there are some seepy wetland seeps on the north slope that look really cool, really old, really undisturbed. I mean, honestly, they almost look kind of mafic, which, you know, doesn't really make sense with my understanding of the geology there, but they're high organic matter. And I've only seen them at the wrong time of year, fall and then winter. But I think those deserve a closer look, and there's no seepy wetlands on the south aspect at all. So that's all new. Yeah, so they at first glance, they most remind me of the seeps at the base of the north side of Buffalo Mountain. So we might pick up some cool wetland plants there for sure.
Do you expect any hemlock stands out on that new section?
I mean, there is hemlock there, Will. I haven't in the spots where you would expect it to be most dense. I have not seen big old stands of it. It isn't worth noting that the north slope has been much more actively managed, but in terms of logging. That said, it's been very lightly logged. The family that owned it was the family that owned these several thousand acres. They did all the logging themselves with, you know, chainsaw, one tree at a time. Sold a lot of chestnut oak to Ohio to become floors, and a lot of veneer quality hardwoods to Asia to become furniture. But I mean, this was very light operation. Cut a tree with a chainsaw. The wife would skid it to the deck, and then they drove it themselves to the port in Newport News. This was a very vertically integrated operation, but so it was very light touch. But yeah, I'm most excited botanically about the wetlands on the north slope. The nice thing about even the most actively managed parts of the new additions, even though they've been thinned, I kind of think of it as going back in time, because this remote part of Giles County, probably because of its remoteness, has just a paucity of invasive species. And so even areas where there's been some soil disturbance from the logging, you know, I feel like I'm going back in time, because the natural succession of plant species from that high disturbance bare mineral soil back to forest it's mostly, if not entirely in places, native flora. And so I kind of feel like over 100 years ago, invasive plants weren't a problem in just disturbed areas because they weren't here yet. And so by some twist of fate and good fortune, much of the preserve is like that. So that's pretty neat too. But yeah, you have to come out, take a look, Will.
Hey, Brenda.
Any other questions for Ryan? Okay, well, thank you very much for Ryan. This is very much appreciated. And I didn't know anything about that passenger pigeon, the consequences of them nesting and roosting there. That was interesting. A lot of other things that I found interesting too. So we will be putting this eventually on YouTube on our chapter and site. And then other people will be able to watch it too then. So thank you very much.
Thank you all. Enjoy the rest of your meeting.
Okay. Okay, let's see. As I said earlier, that the next month's October's chapter meeting will be held at the Blacksburg Library Meeting Room. That will be Jamie King, the first ever Virginia Tech forester, talking about urban forestry. Then the November meeting, we're not certain where that is yet. That will be talking about the Radford University greenhouse and their outdoor native plant display.
Actually, Brenda, she already decided to do Zoom.
Oh, she did? Okay, good. Okay. Okay. And then the December meeting, we're going to try holding that in person, and I'm still working out a place to have it. We'll be holding our usual displays of people with photos or talking about different books or other presentations, short presentations, but I'm still trying to find a place to hold it at. Let's see. Yesterday was the quarterly board meeting at the state level of Virginia Native Plant Society. I wasn't able to make it, but Mary was able to make it. And she's got a couple of items that she wants to talk about that.
Yeah, this will be real quick. First of all, for those of you maybe that can't lead hikes anymore, that don't drive a lot or even come to meetings, Nancy Veers said they plan to have, I think it's an online auction as a fundraiser between now, and I think she's talking about between now and Christmas. And all they're asking for is a few volunteers, which means you just work over your computer. They just want a small committee to plan this online auction. And I wasn't sure if she meant we could donate things, but if you're like me and have things in your house that you think somebody might want, if you don't know Nancy Veers's email, of course you can look online. But what I'll do is I'll look tomorrow and find out if they do want donations. So I'm thinking maybe a book or something, just anything they could auction online. And as I say, there's no date yet. Okay, the other very interesting thing just came kind of out of the blue last night, and that is Jim Hurley, if you know him, was talking a lot about invasives in the next meeting and so on and so on. But what came up is that there's several people in our Native Plant Society that have a few acres. Sometimes it's 3, sometimes it's 7, like Jim Hurley's, sometimes it's bigger. And they have managed it, but only with native plants. And astounding to me is that 3 of them have reported having horrible problems with, they mentioned 3 different native plants last night that have gone so wild. They're using glyphosate, or at least Jim Hurley is on it. And one was little blue stem. One was, I think it's called Canadian goldenrod. And the other one is some kind of coreopsis. I couldn't catch the species, but they're like growing so tall and so aggressively, they're taking over a whole field. And Jim Hurley said that his coreopsis and little blue stem, he had to cut a lot and treat those clumps of little blue stem with glyphosate and blah, blah, blah. And the coreopsis, either way, was taking over the whole field. He was trying to make a warm season meadow or something like that. I mean, you know, it's just bits and pieces of information. Anyway, I think I'm going to ask Nancy to put an article in the next issue, if they can, or one of the issues of sempervirens, for these people to tell their story, because it went on for quite a while last night about, should you put natives into your property if they're not native to like your area and you live in the Piedmont, but the plant might be from the mountains, because this sort of thing happens. So we have another whole thing besides invasive plants. Okay, that's all.
Okay, there was one more thing. I found an email. I'm checking on it now.
Don't forget the native plant sale this weekend.
Yeah, no, I'm still looking for this other email that we just got from, let's see, where did it go to? Come on. They were talking about, I can't remember if it was this, do you remember if it was this weekend for that meeting down in Richmond for the invasive species?
Yes, everybody that signed up for the statewide meeting, which is on Zoom, is coming up this Friday and Saturday. I think it's 7 to 9 with speakers on both nights and the vote and all that. And of course, it will be recorded, but if you do want to vote on some of the slate of new officers, you'll have to do it live this Friday or Saturday. That's the meeting we used to all go to and have field trips, but it's just on Zoom this year. It was on
Yeah,
Zoom.
that's the annual conference.
So you'll
Okay.
probably get a reminder with the link pretty soon.
Yeah, I'm going to send out sometime this week a list of other events for September and that I just found
Okay.
out about. So I'll include that for the annual conference. Okay. Carol, are you still on? Do you want to talk about the plant sale for this Saturday? Let me see if she's still.
Oh, hi. Well, I didn't expect to, but I sent out to you a notice, a reminder about the native plant sale on Saturday. This coming Saturday, there's a whole lot of people that are working to make it really, really fantastic this year. This is only the third year, and we've got so many people donating their time and their talents that I think it's going to be something that you're not going to want to miss. So come out this Saturday from 10 until 3 at the Price House Seeds Nature Center on Lee Street in Blacksburg. We'll have a lot of native plants for sale. You won't want to miss it. So come on out then.
Okay, and all of the proceeds will be going for our grant, which we have for local children for creating or adding on to native pollinator gardens. So proceeds will be used for that. And we'll be having a table there to advertise about this chapter. I only have one volunteer for it so far. So if you're interested in just talking to people, all the volunteers will be required to wear a mask, and the public, we're going to highly recommend that they wear a mask in that, just because we got so many variants in that with the COVID and that. But yes, it will be good there. We'll be having a storyteller for the children to visit in that. You can take a look to see how the native pollinator beds are doing there. That was started, I think, back in 2013, 2014 by the master gardeners in Rosemary Sodden, who is still working there, and I'm working a little bit there. So you can take a look at some of the natives there, but be careful of the poison ivy, which is all over the place, which is native, but wildlife eat it, but it's not good for humans. Let's see, I'm trying to think if does anybody else have any announcements they want to make? Well, if anybody has any suggestions for programs for next year, just send them to Mary Rhodes, and she's working on that. I'm working on hikes and that. I don't know if we'll have any more this fall. We had the one that Beth Oberger had over to the Depot Park in Christiansburg. Next year, I'm going to ask for, because it got ruined by the pandemic last year, of course. I had 2 hikes set up for the Hungry Mother State Park in the spring and the fall, but that didn't pan out, of course. So I skipped this year, and I'm going to ask them next year if they think it's feasible to have 2 hikes down there, because I've been there both spring and fall, and it's very nice native plant area in that. I also want to have one at the Beagle Ridge Herb Farm. This Saturday, they're going to be having down, this is down in Wythe, and they have their outdoor butterfly housing in that, and there will be what is it called? Tagging monarchs and releasing them. And I'm going to try to set up a hike for them for next summer, probably. They got a lot of very nice native plants down there. And I'm also want to contact the Friends of Peak Creek. They've got like 2 or 3 different native plant beds there too, that I want to see if we can set up hikes for next year. So hopefully next year we'll be getting more into outdoor stuff and that. We just started a little bit this year to see how it's going to work out in that. Any comments about speakers or hikes or anything? Just let me know that, or let Barry know about the speakers and that, and let me know about the hikes and that. Anything else that anybody wants to talk about?
Fred and I are just looking it up. So if you wanted to, I should have asked you, if you
Mhm.
wanted to visit Chestnut Ridge Natural Area, can you go there, and are there trails there?
I have a feeling.
No, if you read about it online, Beth,
Yeah.
there's not like Buffalo Mountain. You'd have to call Ryan and schedule something, but it's very, very steep and hard to get into. So you have to be in better shape than I am, I know. But
So it's not-
those guys are really busy, so it's fine. But anyway, no, it's not just open to walk in.
Okay.
Okay, well, thanks everybody for attending the chapter meeting, and hope to see you either this Saturday at the plant sale or next month in person at the Blacksburg Library meeting room then for our next meeting then.
And don't forget, we need people to vote on in October.
Yes, I'll be sending out information about that. Will be for our directors on the board. I can't remember if we have 2 or 3 positions available, so I will send out some information about that. And if anybody wants to volunteer to be on the board, let me know that. Okay, thanks everyone then for being here tonight then, and see you soon then. Bye-bye.